The winter of 1883 didn't just freeze the Wyoming plains. It buried men, cattle, and promises under 6 feet of unforgiving ice. They called it the Great White Death, out where the telegraph wires snapped like brittle twigs and the wind howled like a wounded animal. Survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a brutal, bleeding negotiation with God. For a lone rider seeking shelter, the dark, snow-choked way station at O'Neill's Crossing was a fragile godsend. But he wasn't the first to claim it. Huddled in the freezing dark, clutching a worthless marriage contract and a threadbare shawl, was a woman the world had deliberately thrown away. And the storm was the least of her problems. Silas McCready did not believe in divine intervention. But as the temperature plummeted to 30 below and the snow blinded him in a churning vortex of white, he was ready to concede that hell could freeze over. He was a man whittled down by the elements, 34 years old but carrying the weary bones of a man twice that. His heavy buffalo hide coat was armored in ice, and his roan gelding, Buster, was blowing hard, his muzzle rimmed with frost. They had been tracking a stray herd of rustled steers near the Laramie foothills when the sky bruised purple and the bottom dropped out of the thermometer. Experienced frontiersmen knew that when the air tasted of ozone and your spit froze before it hit the dirt, you stopped moving and dug in. Silas knew the old stagecoach stop at O'Neill's Crossing was less than a mile east. It had been abandoned since the Union Pacific Railroad laid tracks further south, but its sod and timber walls were thick enough to block the wind. Silas urged Buster forward, the snow already cresting the horse's knees. Through the blinding sheet of white, the jagged silhouette of the way station finally emerged. It was a bleak, sagging structure, its corral fences broken like rotten teeth. Silas swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching loudly in the dead silence between the howling gusts of wind. He led Buster into the dilapidated lean-to attached to the main cabin, stripping the saddle with numb, clumsy fingers and throwing a woolen blanket over the trembling animal. "Hold steady, old son," Silas muttered, his voice a raspy scrape in the cold. He unholstered his Colt. .45, a reflex born of hard years on a lawless frontier, and pushed his shoulder against the heavy oak door of the station. The latch gave way with a screech of rusted iron. Inside, it was darker than the devil's heart and nearly as cold. The familiar smells of ancient wood smoke, stale tobacco, and dry rot hung in the stagnant air. Silas struck a sulfur match against the doorframe. The sudden flare of yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing a ruined interior. Overturned chairs, a collapsed table, and a hearth filled with dead gray ash. Then, the match illuminated something that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. In the farthest corner, wedged between a rotting dry goods counter and the wall, sat a lump of snow-dusted fabrics. Silas drew his weapon up, his eyes narrowing. The lump shifted. A weak, rattling sound, the desperate intake of a shallow breath, echoed in the quiet room. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides, the match burning down to his fingertips. He struck another, holding it low. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight, shivering ball, dressed in a once fine woolen traveling suit that was entirely unsuited for the brutal Wyoming winter. A cheap, faux leather carpet bag was clutched against her chest like a shield. Her face was pale as milk glass, her lips tinged a dangerous, bruised blue. Frost clung to her eyelashes and the loose strands of dark hair that had escaped her pinned hat. "Ma'am?" Silas asked, his voice sharp, trying to cut through the lethargy of hypothermia. She didn't open her eyes. Her teeth were chattering so violently that he could hear the click of enamel. She was slipping into the final, deadly stages of the cold sleep, where the body stops shivering and the mind surrenders. "Damn it," Silas swore, holstering his gun and dropping to his knees. He grabbed her by the shoulders. She was stiff, practically frozen through. "Wake up, you hear me? Open your eyes." He shook her, harder than he wanted to, but necessity demanded cruelty. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of bruised slate. They were unfocused, glassy. "Jeb?" she whispered, the syllable cracking in her dry throat. You came." "No Jeb here," lady," Silas said grimly. "And if you don't wake up, neither of us are going to be here tomorrow." He didn't wait for permission. Silas hauled her up. She was dead weight, her legs giving out instantly. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she was beneath the heavy, damp wool. He carried her to the center of the room, laying her on the only unbroken bench. Survival was an equation, and Silas worked it with ruthless efficiency. He moved to the hearth. The station master had left a small cache of dried buffalo chips and some splintered pine crates. Silas arranged them with practiced speed, pulling a handful of dry prairie grass from his own saddlebags for tinder. Within minutes, a small but fierce fire was crackling in the stone fireplace, casting dancing orange shadows across the room. He turned back to the woman. The fire wouldn't be enough if she remained in those damp, freezing clothes. "Ma'am, I have to get this coat off you," Silas announced. He didn't wait for a response. He unbuttoned the sodden wool jacket, pulling her arms free. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton blouse that offered zero protection. He stripped off his own heavy buffalo coat, the only thing standing between him and the biting chill of the room, and wrapped it tightly around her trembling frame. He pulled his canteen from his gear, setting it near the fire to thaw the ice inside. Then, he sat beside her, took her icy, gloveless hands in his own large, calloused ones, and began to rub them vigorously, forcing the blood to circulate. As he worked, his eyes fell on the carpet bag that had slipped from her grasp. A crumpled piece of yellow paper had fallen from its side pocket. A Western Union telegram. Silas leaned over, picking it up. The ink was slightly smeared, but the typed letters were legible. "Miss Minna Higgins. Stop. Arrive Cheyenne 12th. Stop. Will meet at O'Neill Crossing 14th. Stop. Bring the ledger. Stop. Forever yours, Jebediah Sterling." Silas felt a cold knot form in his gut that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He looked down at the woman, Minna. She was a mail-order bride, lured out to the edge of the world. But worse than that, she had been lured by Jebediah Sterling. Silas knew Jeb Sterling. Half the territory knew him. He was a silver-tongued grifter, a card sharp who owed money to every dangerous man from Deadwood to Denver. Jeb Sterling didn't buy mail-order brides. He bought marks. And whoever Minna Higgins was, she wasn't just here for a wedding. She had something he wanted, and Jeb had left her here to die. It took 3 hours for the violent shivering to subside. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the timber walls, shaking the very foundation of the way station. The wind sounded like a chorus of damned souls, searching for a way in. Silas sat cross-legged by the hearth, feeding the fire with broken floorboards he'd pried up with his Bowie knife. He had melted snow in a small tin cup, steeping a pinch of bitter willow bark and coffee grounds, and forced it down Minna's throat. Slowly, the dangerous blue faded from her lips, replaced by the pale, flushed pink of a returning pulse. Minna shifted under the massive buffalo coat, her slate-gray eyes opening. This time, there was clarity in them, and a sharp, sudden terror. She bolted upright, gasping, her hands instinctively flying to her chest. She looked at the fire, then at the desolate room, and finally, at the rugged, bearded stranger sitting a few feet away, tending a tin cup over the flames. Where am I?" she demanded, her voice raspy but surprisingly firm. She pulled the heavy coat tighter around her neck. "Where is Mr. Pendleton?" "The station agent?" "Pendleton boarded up and headed for Laramie 3 days ago when the telegraph lines went dead," Silas said, not looking up as he stirred the coffee. "He left you here. He said he was going to fetch help." Minna's voice hitched, a sudden, desperate realization dawning on her. "He said he'd bring Jebediah." Silas pulled the tin cup from the fire, setting it on a stone to cool. He finally looked at her. His eyes were a piercing, unreadable brown, framed by weather-beaten skin that told stories of hard miles and harder choices. "Nobody is coming in this storm, Miss Higgins," Silas said quietly. "Not Pendleton. And certainly not Jeb Sterling." Minna flinched at the use of her name. Her eyes darted around frantically until she spotted her carpetbag sitting near Silas's boots. She lunged for it, nearly falling off the bench, but Silas was faster. He put a heavy boot squarely on the bag. "Please," Mina whispered, her bravado shattering. "That's all I have in the world. I'm not going to steal it," Silas said, moving his foot and nudging the bag toward her. "But before you go clutching it like salvation, you need to understand something. You were freezing to death. You were about 20 minutes away from falling asleep and never waking up. I don't care what's in the bag. I care about why a woman from the East is sitting in a dead way station in the middle of the worst blizzard of the decade waiting for a ghost." Mina pulled the bag onto her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped the handles. "He isn't a ghost. He's my fiancé. We've been corresponding for 8 months. He owns a cattle ranch near Bitter Creek." Silas let out a dry, humorless scoff. He poured a small measure of the muddy coffee into a secondary tin and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it, her hands trembling as the heat radiated into her palms. "Drink," Silas commanded gently. "Jeb Sterling doesn't own a ranch, Miss Higgins. He doesn't own the dirt on his boots. He's a professional liar. Last I heard, he was running a crooked faro table in Cheyenne and was into the Montana boys for $3,000. He's a wanted man." Mina stared at him over the rim of the cup. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp, elegant lines of her cheekbones and the deep exhaustion under her eyes. She didn't look shocked. She didn't burst into tears. Instead, a profound, heavy resignation seemed to settle over her. "I know," she whispered. Silas paused, his eyes narrowing. "You know?" Mina took a sip of the bitter coffee, grimacing at the taste but swallowing it down. "I didn't know at first. His letters. They were beautiful. They promised a fresh start, a wide-open sky. I was suffocating in Providence. My husband passed away 3 years ago, leaving me with nothing but a mountain of debts and a brother-in-law who thought I was part of the estate he inherited." She looked down at the carpet bag. "I started writing to Jebediah. I thought I was being cautious, but 2 weeks before I left, I received a letter from a Pinkerton agent looking for information on a Jebediah Sterling. He detailed everything, the cons, the gambling, the warrants." "Then why in God's name did you get on the train?" Silas asked, genuinely baffled. Mina looked up, her jaw set with a fierce, brittle pride. "Because my brother-in-law, Thomas, discovered my late husband had a secret safety deposit box in Boston. Inside was a ledger. It contained the deeds to over 10,000 acres of prime timberland in Oregon that Thomas had been trying to steal from me for years. I took the ledger. I ran." She reached into the bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, clutching it to her chest. "I couldn't stay in Providence," Mina continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Thomas has judges and police in his pocket. If I stayed, he would have had me committed to an asylum and taken the land. Jebediah was a scoundrel, yes, but his letters told me exactly where he was. I didn't come here to marry him. I came here to pay him." Silas stared at her, putting the pieces together. "You brought a ledger worth a fortune to a desperate con man. I was going to offer him 10% of the land's value to act as my proxy, sell the land in San Francisco, and get me passage to Australia," Mina said, her voice dropping. "He needed money. I needed a ghost. Someone Thomas couldn't trace. I sent Jeb a telegram saying I had the ledger. He told me to meet him here. And instead, he left you to freeze," Silas concluded, shaking his head. "Miss Higgins, you are either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. Jeb didn't show up because he didn't plan to bargain. Why take 10% when he could let the winter do his dirty work and take it all from your frozen hands?" Mina's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. "I had no choice. Hope was all I had left. And now I have nothing." "You have your life," Silas said gruffly. "For tonight, anyway. We ride out at first light, assuming the snow breaks." "Where will we go?" she asked. "Laramie," Silas replied, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "Put you on a train going west. Get you out of the territory before whoever Jeb owes money to realizes he had a rich widow coming to meet him." Silas didn't tell her the darkest part of his thought. Jeb Sterling was a coward. If he knew a ledger worth thousands was sitting at O'Neill's Crossing, the storm wouldn't have kept him away. The only thing that would keep Jeb Sterling from money was a bullet, which meant someone else might know about the ledger, and they might be coming for it. The storm did not break. By midnight, the wind had escalated from a howl to a sustained, deafening roar. The temperature inside the cabin was barely above freezing. Despite the fire, Silas kept relentlessly fed. The cold and exhaustion finally caught up with Minna. Around 2 in the morning, the fever set in. Silas knew the signs. Her skin flushed a dangerous, dry red, and she began to thrash weakly beneath the heavy buffalo coat, muttering deliriously. The brutal drop in her core temperature earlier, followed by the sudden warmth, had shocked her system. In the harsh reality of the frontier, a fever in a snowbound cabin was often a death sentence. Silas moved with grim purpose. He tore a strip of clean linen from his own spare shirt in his saddlebag, soaked it in the cold, melted snow, and pressed it firmly against Minna's burning forehead. "Thomas." "No, please," she murmured, tossing her head back, her eyes squeezed shut in the throes of a nightmare. "The ledger is mine. It's mine. Easy, Minna," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble meant to anchor her. He didn't realize he had used her first name. "You're safe. Nobody is taking anything from you." He spent the next 3 hours locked in a battle against her rising temperature. He continually re-soaked the cloth, forced droplets of water past her cracked lips, and kept the fire blazing. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a profound sense of protectiveness swelling in his chest. Silas McCready was a solitary man. He rode alone, slept alone, and preferred the company of his horse to most people. He had seen enough betrayal and blood to sour him on humanity. Yet, looking at this desperate, fiercely intelligent woman who had risked everything for her freedom, he felt a crack in the armor he had worn for a decade. By 5 a.m., the fever broke. A sheen of sweat covered Minna's face, and her breathing finally leveled out into a deep, natural sleep. Silas slumped against the wall near the hearth, exhausted, his muscles aching from tension. He closed his eyes, intending to rest for just a moment. That was when Buster whinnied. It wasn't a casual snort. It was a high, sharp sound of alarm coming from the lean-to outside. Silas's eyes snapped open, exhaustion instantly evaporating, replaced by a surge of cold adrenaline. He stood up silently, drawing his Colt .45, and stepping away from the firelight to blend into the shadows near the front window. He peered through the thick layer of frost on the cracked glass. The wind had died down to a low moan, the snow falling in heavy, silent sheets. In the pale, gray pre-dawn light, Silas saw them. 3 riders. Their horses were plunging through the deep drifts, exhausted but pushing hard toward the way station. The men were bundled in heavy dusters and scarves, their faces obscured, but the way they rode spread out. Cautious, rifles drawn from their scabbards told Silas everything he needed to know. They weren't travelers seeking shelter. They were hunters. Silas moved swiftly to the heavy oak door, throwing the heavy iron deadbolt across with a dull clunk. The sound woke Minna. She sat up, clutching the buffalo coat, her eyes wide with confusion and lingering fever haze. "Silas? What is it?" "Get down," Silas ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. "Behind the counter. Stay flat on the floor and don't make a sound." Minna didn't argue. She saw the gun in his hand and the tension in his shoulders. She scrambled off the bench, grabbing her carpet bag, and threw herself behind the thick, rotting wood of the dry goods counter. Outside, the crunch of hooves stopped just beyond the door. Heavy boots hit the wooden porch. "Jeb!" a voice yelled over the wind. It was a harsh, gravelly voice. "Jeb, you in there, you useless son of a bitch?" Silas remained silent, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Colt. "We found his horse frozen a mile back, boss," a second voice called out. "If he made it on foot, he's inside." Heavy fists pounded on the oak door, rattling it in its frame. "Open up, Jeb. We know about the Boston widow. We know about the ledger. You owe Mr. Sterling his cut." Silas's eyes narrowed. Mr. Sterling? If Jeb was the one who owed money, who was outside? "I ain't freezing my tail off out here," the first voice shouted. "Kick the damn door in." There was a heavy thud against the wood. The door groaned but held. Silas knew he couldn't wait for them to breach the room. In a confined space, stray bullets would kill Minna. He stepped to the side of the door, his voice ringing out loud and clear. "The door's locked, and Jeb Sterling ain't here," Silas shouted. "Whoever you are, turn around and ride back the way you came." There was a beat of silence outside. "Who the hell is that?" the gravelly voice demanded. "Where's Jeb?" "Dead. For all I know," Silas replied coldly. "I'm just a rider waiting out the storm. This is a private fire. Move along." A dark chuckle echoed from the porch. "Well, stranger, that's a shame. Because my name is Harlan Sterling. Jeb was my idiot younger brother. He owed me $5,000, and he said a little eastern bird was bringing a ledger to this exact spot that would clear his debt. So, either you open this door, or we shoot it off its hinges and take what's ours over your dead body." Behind the counter, Minna clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Jeb had sold her out to his own brother to settle a debt. Silas looked back at Minna. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, the way she clutched the bag containing her only hope for a future. Harlan Sterling was a known rustler, a man who would shoot a woman as soon as look at her. Silas McCready took a deep breath, feeling the familiar, icy calm of impending violence settle over his nerves. He thumbed back the hammer of his Colt, the mechanical click sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Harlan," Silas called out, his voice steady as stone. "You're going to want to get back on your horse." "Why's that?" Harlan sneered through the wood. "Because," Silas said, stepping directly in front of the door, "my name is Silas McCready, and the next man to touch this door is going to catch a bullet in his throat." A deadly silence fell over O'Neill's Crossing. The negotiation with God was over. The shooting was about to begin. The name hung in the freezing air like a ghost. Outside, the crunch of boots on the snow abruptly stopped. For a span of 10 heartbeats, the only sound was the wind howling over the sagging roof of O'Neill's Crossing. Silas McCready, Harlan Sterling's voice filtered through the heavy oak door. The bravado suddenly stripped from his tone, replaced by a cautious, venomous hiss. "The regulator from Dodge City, the man who put a bullet in the eye of Charlie Bowdry's cousin. I thought you died in the Dakota Territories. Rumors of my demise were exaggerated." "Harlan," Silas called back, his voice devoid of emotion. His eyes tracked a shadow moving past the frosted front window. "Now, I'll give you to the count of 3 to get back on your horses. 1. You're protecting a dead man's mark, McCready," Harlan shouted, his voice moving to the left. He was trying to flank the door. "That ledger belongs to the Sterling family now." 2. Silas didn't wait for 3. He knew the rhythm of a gunfight. The man who waited for the final count was usually the man who ended up bleeding into the floorboards. He saw the silhouette pause at the window, raising a lever-action Winchester rifle. Silas pivoted, leveling his Colt. The deafening roar of the heavy-caliber hand cannon shattered the confined silence of the cabin. The window exploded outward in a shower of glass, frost, and splintered pine. A high-pitched scream tore through the storm outside, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow-covered porch. "Boyd, damn it," Harlan roared. "Light it up. Shoot through the walls." The cabin instantly turned into a nightmare of flying splinters and deafening noise. Bullets tore through the rotting sod and thin timber walls, punching holes that let in biting streams of icy wind. Silas hit the floor, rolling toward the heavy stone hearth. Behind the dry goods counter, Minna screamed, pressing herself flat against the dirt floor, her hands clamped over her ears. The carpet bag was tucked securely beneath her chest. "Stay down, Minna." Silas barked over the gunfire. He crawled on his belly toward the shattered window. The cold air rushing in was blinding, but it cleared the gun smoke filling the room. He risked a glance over the sill. Boyd was writhing on the porch, clutching a shattered shoulder. His Winchester dropped in the snow. Harlan and a third man, a bulky brute wearing a buffalo hide cap, had taken cover behind the broken corral fence. The brute stood up, resting his rifle barrel on the top rail to take aim at the window. Silas thumbed the hammer and fired. The bullet sparked off the iron corral ring just inches from the man's face, showering him with rust and forcing him back down. "Go around the back, Clem," Harlan yelled. "Kick in the lean-to door," Silas cursed under his breath. The lean-to where Buster was tied led directly to a flimsy interior door at the rear of the cabin. If Clem got in there, they would be caught in a crossfire. Silas ejected the spent casings from his Colt, his cold, stiff fingers fumbling as he shoved fresh brass cartridges from his gun belt into the cylinder. "Mina!" he yelled. "The back door!" Mina opened her eyes. The fever still burned at the edges of her vision, but the sheer terror of the moment cut through the haze. She looked toward the rear of the cabin. The flimsy wooden door connecting the main room to the lean-to was rattling. Someone was throwing their weight against it. Silas was pinned down. If he moved from the window, Harlan would shoot him in the back. Mina didn't think. She acted on a primal surge of survival. She scrambled out from behind the counter, her eyes darting around the ruined room. Near the hearth, half buried in the ashes, was a heavy, cast-iron skillet the station master had left behind. She crawled toward it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wood above her head splintered as another bullet from Harlan found the cabin wall. She grabbed the iron handle. It was freezing cold and heavy as a stone. The rear door gave way with a sickening crack, flying off its rusted iron hinges. Clem stumbled into the room, a wicked-looking Remington revolver in his hand, his eyes adjusting to the dim, smoky light. He saw Silas pinned at the front window. A cruel smile spread across his face as he raised his gun. He never saw Mina. Using both hands and every ounce of strength left in her fever-weakened body, Mina swung the cast-iron skillet upward. It connected with the side of Clem's knee with a sickening crunch. The massive man roared in pain, his leg buckling instantly. His shot went wild, burying itself into the ceiling beams. Silas whipped around at the sound of the gunshot. He saw the giant falling forward and Mina scrambling backward on her hands and knees. Silas didn't hesitate. He leveled his Colt and put a single bullet squarely into Clem's chest. The man hit the dirt floor like a felled oak and didn't move. Outside, the gunfire ceased. "Clem?" Harlan's voice called out, laced with sudden uncertainty. "Clem, you got him?" Silence reigned in the cabin, save for the ragged breathing of Silas and Mina and the howling wind through the shattered window. "Harlan!" Silas roared, his voice carrying the lethal authority of a man who had survived 100 such encounters. "Clem is dead. Boyd is bleeding out on your porch. You want to make it a trio. You step through that door. Otherwise, you strap your boy to his saddle and ride." For a long, tense minute, there was no sound but the storm. Then, the crunch of snow. Silas watched through the window as Harlan broke cover, grabbed Boyd by his coat collar, and dragged him violently toward their horses. "This ain't over, McCready." Harlan screamed over the wind as he hoisted his wounded man into the saddle. "That ledger belongs to the Swan Land and Cattle Company now. You're dead men walking." Silas watched them ride out, disappearing into the white vortex of the blizzard. Only when the sound of hooves was completely swallowed by the storm did he slowly lower his gun. He turned to look at Mina. She was sitting on the floor, staring at the dead man a few feet away, the iron skillet still resting by her knee. She was trembling violently, the shock finally breaking through her adrenaline. Silas walked over to her. He didn't offer platitudes. He knelt beside her, checking her face. The fever flush was back, but her eyes were clear. "You saved my life, Mina," Silas said quietly, his voice a stark contrast to the violence that had just filled the room. Mina looked up at him, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line down her ash-smudged cheek. "He was going to kill you." "I know," Silas said. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping the tear away. It was an intimate gesture, born of shared survival. "You're a long way from Providence, Miss Higgins." Silas winced, a sudden, sharp intake of breath escaping his lips. He looked down at his left arm, The sleeve of his woolen shirt was torn, and a dark, spreading stain of crimson was pooling near his bicep. In the chaos, a splinter of wood or a glancing bullet had caught him. Minna saw it, and her trembling stopped. The society widow vanished, replaced by a woman hardened by the frontier in a single night. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice firm. "Let me see that." The storm broke just after dawn, leaving behind a world encased in blinding, flawless white. The sky was an unnatural, piercing blue, mocking the violence that had occurred in the dark. Inside the cabin, Minna finished tearing the last clean strip of cotton from her petticoat. She wrapped it tightly around Silas's bicep, tying it off with practiced efficiency. The bullet had only grazed the muscle, but it had bled fiercely. "It's not deep, but it's going to ache," Minna said, pulling her hands away. Her fingers were stained with his blood. "I've had worse from a green-broke Mustang," Silas muttered, rolling his shoulder to test the bandage. He looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you." He stood up, grabbing his saddlebags. "We need to move. Harlan won't ride all the way to Laramie in this snow. He'll head for the nearest line shack, drop Boyd, and try to find a telegraph or more men. If he's working for the Swan Land and Cattle Company, he has deep pockets behind him." Minna frowned, picking up her carpetbag. "He said the ledger belongs to them." "Why would a Wyoming cattle syndicate care about timberland in Oregon?" Silas paused, looking at the bag. "Because maybe your brother-in-law Thomas didn't just want to steal your land, Minna. Maybe he already sold it." Minna's breath hitched. "Sold it? How? He didn't have the deed. He wouldn't need it if he had an agreement in principle with a company expanding out west," Silas explained, kicking dirt over the dying fire to extinguish it. "The Swan Company buys up land across 4 territories. If Thomas promised them the Oregon timber, and then you disappeared with the ledger proving ownership, well, they wouldn't send Pinkertons. They'd send men like Harlan Sterling to clean up the mess and bring the paperwork back. Jeb was just the bait to get you out here." Minna felt a cold dread settle in her stomach that was worse than the winter chill. She hadn't just run from a greedy relative. She had walked directly into a corporate war, carrying the very prize they were willing to kill for. "Then we can't go to Laramie," Minna said, her voice shaking but resolute. "If the Swan Company operates there, the law will be in their pockets. A sheriff will just hand me over to them." Silas looked at her, impressed by her quick deduction. "You're right. Laramie is a company town. We need to head south, toward the Colorado border. Place called Cheyenne. There's a federal judge there, John Watts. He hates the cattle barons. If we get that ledger to him, he can authenticate the deeds and put an injunction on your brother-in-law." "Cheyenne is a 5-day ride," Minna said, looking out the shattered window at the 3-foot snowdrifts. "We'll manage," Silas said. He led Buster out of the lean-to. The roan horse was rested but anxious, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Silas saddled him quickly, packing their meager supplies. "I only have 1 horse," Silas said, turning to Minna. "It's going to be close quarters." He mounted first, wincing slightly as his injured arm took his weight. He reached down with his right hand. Minna looked at his gloved hand, then up at his weathered face. There was no deceit in his eyes, only a quiet, unyielding strength. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her up effortlessly, settling her into the saddle right behind him. "Put your arms around my waist," Silas instructed. "Keep your face pressed against my coat. The wind out on the plains will cut you to the bone." Minna hesitated for a fraction of a second, then wrapped her arms tightly around his solid midsection. She pressed her cheek against the rough, freezing leather of his buffalo coat, but beneath it, she could feel the steady, radiating heat of his body. They rode out of O'Neill's crossing, leaving the dead man on the floor and the shattered window behind. The journey south was a brutal test of endurance. The Wyoming landscape was a vast, terrifying ocean of white. The snowdrifts were deep, forcing Buster to a grueling, high-stepping walk that consumed hours to cover mere miles. The silence of the plains was absolute, broken only by the crunch of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. For the first few hours, They didn't speak. Surviving the cold took all their concentration, but as the sun hit its zenith, reflecting off the snow with a blinding glare, the shared physical proximity began to melt the ice between them. Minna, her hands tucked inside Silas's coat pockets for warmth, broke the silence. "You're a regulator," she said, her voice muffled against his back. "Harlan called you that. What does it mean?" Silas kept his eyes on the horizon, navigating by the jagged peaks of the distant Medicine Bow Mountains. "It means I'm a man who gets paid to enforce rules in places where the law hasn't arrived yet. Sometimes for cattle associations, sometimes for towns. I hunt down rustlers, thieves, men like Harlan. You're a bounty hunter." "I prefer the term problem solver," Silas replied, a hint of dry humor in his rough voice. "But yeah, I deal in blood money. And what happens when you solve this problem?" Minna asked softly. "When we get to Cheyenne, and the ledger is safe?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He felt the tightening of her arms around his waist. For 10 years, his life had been a solitary ride, from one violent encounter to the next. He had never considered a destination, only the journey. But feeling Minna pressed against him, a woman who had fought for her own survival with an iron skillet and a desperate heart, the idea of riding away empty-handed felt suddenly hollow. "I suppose I'll buy you a ticket on the Union Pacific to San Francisco," Silas finally said. "And, maybe, I'll buy one for myself." Minna smiled, hiding her face against his coat. The biting cold of the Wyoming winter suddenly didn't feel quite so deadly, but the harsh reality of the frontier was never far away. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, Silas pulled Buster to a sudden halt. He stiffened, his hand dropping instinctively to the stock of the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. "What is it?" Minna whispered, sensing his tension. "Look," Silas said, pointing to a ridge about a half-mile to the east. Silhouetted against the pale winter sky were 5 riders. They were sitting perfectly still, watching them from the high ground. Even from this distance, Silas could see the glint of sunlight on scoped hunting rifles. "Harlan?" Minna asked, panic rising in her throat. "No," Silas said grimly. "Harlan's men are thugs. Those men are riding in military formation. They're Pinkerton detectives, hired by the Swan Company. And they've found us." The 5 riders on the ridge didn't charge. They didn't need to. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized patience of predators who knew their prey was already trapped in a frozen cage. Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles ticked beneath his beard. He spurred Buster forward, abandoning their cautious pace for a punishing, chest-heaving trot. The roan gelding groaned, hooves punching deep into the crusted snow. "Who are they?" Minna shouted over the sudden rush of wind, her arms clamping tighter around Silas's waist as the horse surged. "Company men," Silas yelled back, scanning the bleak, white horizon. "Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Swan Company doesn't just hire thugs like Harlan Sterling. They hire an army, with badges. William Pinkerton himself probably signed the contract." Minna felt a sickening plunge in her stomach. "If they have badges, does that make us outlaws? Out here, the law is whoever has the most guns and the deepest pockets," Silas said grimly. "Right now, Alexander Swan owns most of the grass in Wyoming, and his men have the high ground." Silas knew the brutal mathematics of the frontier. Carrying 2 riders through waist-deep drifts, Buster would burn out in less than 5 miles. The Pinkertons were riding sleek, grain-fed Morgans. In a straight foot race across the plains, they would be run down before sunset. Silas hauled sharply on the reins, turning dead west, away from the direct route to Cheyenne. "Devil's Gate." Silas answered her unspoken question. "It's a cleft in the Sweetwater granite. The trail narrows down to about 20 feet across. In the canyon, numbers don't matter as much. It's a choke point." The chase became a grueling, terrifying test of endurance. A high-powered Sharps rifle echoed across the valley, a bullet snapping a dead cottonwood branch 20 yards to their right. Buster was lathered in sweat that froze almost instantly into white foam. Behind them, The dark shapes of the 5 Pinkertons grew steadily larger. The rolling plains gave way to jagged foothills until the earth seemed to split open. Devil's Gate was a vertical gash in the rock, cast in deep, frigid shadow. Silas guided Buster 200 yards into the gloom before hauling back on the reins. "Get down," Silas ordered, swinging her to the icy ground. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, gave Buster a hard slap to send the horse further down the canyon out of danger, and pointed to a jumble of fallen granite. "Get behind those rocks. Guard my blind side." He handed her his heavy Colt. 45. "Don't cock the hammer until you're ready to kill." They didn't wait long. The thundering of hooves echoed off the canyon walls as the 5 Pinkertons rode into the shadows, pulling up sharply. The leader trotted his horse forward. He was a tall man in a bowler hat, unsuited for the weather but commanding in presence. Silas recognized him from Dodge City. Elias Stanton, a senior operative known for his ruthlessness. "Silas McCready." Stanton's voice boomed down the canyon. "Throw down your weapons. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Minna Higgins on charges of grand larceny, signed by a magistrate in Rhode Island." Minna gasped. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, had actually filed charges to give the Pinkertons legal cover. "That warrant ain't worth the paper it's printed on in Wyoming territory," Silas yelled back, rifle aimed squarely at Stanton's chest. "You're here to take that ledger to Alexander Swan." Stanton's horse danced nervously on the ice. "Swan is offering $5,000 for the safe return of his property. Walk away, McCready. Leave the woman. And ride out a rich man." Silas looked at Minna. She was staring at him, her heart hammering, the heavy Colt clutched in her hands. $5,000 was a lifetime of peace for a hired gun. Silas turned his eyes back to Stanton, his grip on the Winchester tightening. "The lady's property is not for sale, Elias," Silas said softly, the canyon carrying his words perfectly. "And neither am I." Stanton's face hardened. "Fire at will." The canyon erupted. 5 rifles fired simultaneously, deafening in the confined space. Bullets chipped the granite boulder, spraying Silas and Minna with razor-sharp stone. Silas didn't flinch. He sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger, taking a man to Stanton's left in the shoulder. He fired twice more, aiming for horses' legs to break their formation. Another horse buckled with a shriek. "They're flanking," Minna screamed. One detective had dismounted, scrambling up the steep snow-covered scree on the left side to shoot down behind their boulder. Silas swung his rifle, but the man disappeared behind a jagged rock shelf. A bullet sparked off the stone inches from Minna's head. "Silas, I have him," she yelled. Before he could stop her, Minna stood, leaning over the boulder. Gripping the heavy Colt with both hands, she thumbed back the hammer and leveled it at the ledge. The Pinkerton peeked his head over the rock. Minna pulled the trigger. The recoil threw her backward into the snow, but the bullet struck the rock directly beneath the agent's chin, sending a shower of pulverized granite into his face. He screamed, dropping his rifle, and tumbled blindly down the scree slope. Down the trail, Stanton realized the choke point was a death trap. "Fall back," he roared, violently yanking his horse around. The remaining riders dragged their wounded out of the line of fire. Silas slumped against the boulder. He looked at Minna, smudged with gunpowder and clutching his Colt. She was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. "They'll be back," she panted. "No, they won't," Silas said, pointing up. The concussions from the gunfire had fractured the massive snow cornices overhanging the gorge. A deep, terrifying groan echoed from the rock. "Run!" They sprinted down the canyon. 10 seconds later, thousands of tons of snow and ice broke free. The avalanche crashed onto the trail behind them with the force of a freight train, sealing the northern entrance to Devil's Gate under an impenetrable white wall. They were cut off from the Pinkertons, but now completely trapped on the brutal, frozen trail to Cheyenne. The Wyoming plains demanded a brutal toll, and by the time Silas and Minna rode into the sprawling, muddy streets of Cheyenne, they had paid it in full. It had taken 3 more days of agonizing travel through the frozen wasteland, following the avalanche at Devil's Gate. Their meager supplies had run dry, and Silas was nursing a raging fever from the infected bullet graze on his arm. Buster, the roan gelding, was practically walking on pure heart. Cheyenne was a chaotic boomtown, a noisy collision of cattle wealth, railroad industry, and frontier lawlessness. The streets were choked with freight wagons, weary cowboys, and cattle barons in tailored suits. Silas didn't stop at a saloon, a bathhouse, or a doctor. He rode Buster straight down Capitol Avenue, pulling up in front of the ornate, red brick facade of the federal courthouse. "This is it," Silas rasped, his voice weak and trembling. He practically fell out of the saddle, leaning heavily against the horse to stay upright. Minna slid down beside him, immediately throwing his good arm over her shoulder to support his weight. She clutched her battered carpet bag in her other hand. "Lean on me. We're almost there." They pushed through the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, drawing shocked stares from the clerks and federal marshals. They looked like ghosts, haggard, frostbitten, smelling of wood smoke, dried blood, and absolute desperation. "Judge Watts," Silas demanded of a terrified-looking bailiff, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his Colt. "We need to see Judge John Watts." Right now, 10 minutes later, they were sitting in a stiflingly warm office lined with leather-bound law books. Judge John Watts, a stern man with a shock of white hair and a reputation for being an unbribable thorn in the side of the Wyoming cattle syndicates, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He poured 2 glasses of amber whiskey and slid them across the polished wood. Silas downed his in one gulp, the alcohol burning a clean path through his exhaustion. Mina took a tentative sip, the warmth finally bringing a flush back to her pale, wind-chapped cheeks. "Silas McCready," Watts said, leaning back in his chair. "I heard you died in the Dakota Territories. Now you walk into my courthouse looking like you crawled out of a grave, dragging an Eastern Society woman with you. What kind of trouble have you brought to my city?" Minna didn't wait for Silas to speak. She unlatched the carpet bag, pulled out the heavy ledger, and placed it squarely on the judge's desk. "My name is Minna Higgins," she said, her voice ringing with newfound, hardened authority. "This ledger contains the original deeds, surveyor maps, and purchase receipts for 12,000 acres of the Willamette Valley timberland in Oregon. My brother-in-law, Thomas Higgins, has filed a fraudulent claim of ownership in Providence and is attempting to sell it to the Swan Land and Cattle Company." Judge Watts's eyebrows shot up. He pulled the ledger toward him. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of thick parchment as the judge scrutinized the documents, checking dates and notary seals. Finally, Watts closed the book. "Mrs. Higgins, these documents are ironclad. The land is undeniably yours. And if Alexander Swan is trying to buy it through a proxy, he's engaging in interstate fraud. I can issue a federal injunction blocking any sale immediately." Minna let out her breath she felt she had been holding since she left Rhode Island. Tears of sheer relief slipped down her face, but the heavy door to the judge's office suddenly slammed open. Elias Stanton strode into the room, flanked by 2 local Cheyenne deputies. The Pinkerton operative's bowler hat was gone, replaced by a bandage wrapped around his head. "Judge Watts," Stanton barked. "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of that woman. She is a fugitive, and that ledger is stolen property." Silas was out of his chair in a flash, stepping between Minna and the Pinkerton. "You don't know when to quit, do you, Elias? Stand down, McCready," Stanton sneered, throwing a folded paper onto the desk. "The warrant is signed by a Rhode Island magistrate. The Swan Land and Cattle Company demands her immediate extradition." Judge Watts picked up his gavel and tapped it lightly. "Mr. Stanton," Watts said, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, "you are in my jurisdiction now, and in my courtroom. A warrant signed by a corrupt magistrate on the East Coast carries less weight than horse manure." Stanton bristled. "Alexander Swan will have your robes for this." "Let him try," Watts countered, his eyes flashing. "I have reviewed the original, authenticated deeds. They belong solely to Mrs. Minna Higgins. The only crime committed here is attempted fraud by Thomas Higgins, aided by the illegal intimidation tactics of your agency. If you or any man in Alexander Swan's employ comes within 100 yards of her, I will have you arrested for conspiracy and attempted murder on the Sweetwater Trail. Now, get out of my office." Stanton stared at the judge, then at Silas's cold, triumphant smile. He knew he was beaten. Without a word, the Pinkerton turned and stormed out. 2 weeks later, Minna stood on the platform of the Cheyenne Union Pacific Station. The winter sun was melting the snowdrifts into muddy puddles. The federal injunction was secure. Thomas was under investigation, and her fortune was safe. She wore a new, warm, fur-lined coat. Silas stood next to her, holding Buster's reins, his arm healing well. "The train for San Francisco boards in 20 minutes, Silas said. "Your lawyers are ready. You'll never have to worry about money again." Minna looked at his weathered face. "I don't want to go to San Francisco, Silas. I wanted an escape when I left Providence. But out here, I found out what I'm made of, and I found a man who stood between me and the end of the world." She pulled a heavy envelope from her purse. "There are 12,000 acres of timber up there. It needs managing by someone who knows how to deal with cutthroats and rough terrain. I need a partner, Silas, not a hired gun." Silas stared at the envelope, the solitary regulator feeling a profound shift in the axis of his world. He looked at the woman who had fought beside him and saved his life. He didn't take the envelope. Instead, he took Minna's hand, pulling her gently toward him. "I don't know much about timber, Minna," Silas murmured, a genuine smile breaking through his rough exterior. "That's all right," Minna whispered, her arms wrapping around his neck as the train whistle blew in the distance. "I don't know much about shooting outlaws. We'll teach each other." The Great White Death of 1883 took hundreds of lives, burying secrets and sinners alike beneath the Wyoming snow. But for Silas McCready and Minna Higgins, the storm wasn't a tomb. They entered the abandoned way station as two broken people, a lone regulator running out of road, and a desperate widow running out of hope. Through blood, frostbite, and the relentless pursuit of greedy men, they forged a bond that neither the Pinkertons nor the unforgiving frontier could break. Minna never sailed to Australia, and Silas never rode the solitary trail again. Together, they turned a stolen ledger into a timber empire in Oregon, building a legacy built not on the fragile promises of mail-order romance, but on the undeniable truth of shared survival. In the end, the Wild West didn't break them. It simply stripped away everything they didn't need, leaving only each other.